katkın çok büyük. O yüzden ben şimdi arkama yaslanacağım ve bu iki harika insanın sohbetini sevgili katılımcılarımızla birlikte dinleyeceğim. Tekrardan hoş geldiniz.
Herkese merhaba, teşekkürler deyip bundan sonrasında İngilizce devam edeyim ben de. Hello everybody, thanks to Ashoka for having me today and thanks to everyone who joins us. I am honored to be host of this session today. It is part of Ashoka's Social Entrepreneurship Day and streaming on YouTube. I have a chance to talk with one of most inspiring people for me, David Bornstein. In the next 30 minutes, we are going to talk about the role of information on change making and social entrepreneurship. Please don't hesitate, write your questions to chat box. If we find the time, I want to direct your questions to David. David Bornstein has a book on social entrepreneurship, which was published in 2003 called How to Change the World. The book was a powerful force to get attention and resources for social entrepreneurs and their solutions around the world. He continues to write as a journalist and also is a member of Ashoka's Global Board. David is also the co-founder of Solutions Journalism Network, which aims to spread a reporting method showing potential ways for responding to social problems. Hello, David. Welcome again to Social Entrepreneurship Day.
Thank you. Good morning or good afternoon to you.
Good morning. Let's start with the purpose of our works. 5 years ago, while we were building Teyit as a fact-checking organization, our main goal was to respond to emergent crisis situations like bomb attacks. The information flow went mad after every crisis moment because of the lack of trustworthy sources. What we are aware of today, crises are not going anywhere. They always find a new shape to shake humanity. And it seems as communities, we have to deal with bigger ones such as climate change. In this kind of world, decision-making must be based on truth to survive. Seeking truth and finding accurate information is very important more than ever. We value fact-checking because it helps the people and communities to try to separate fact from fiction. I want to ask, how do you see the relationship between the information and change-making? How can solutions journalism help the communities find their ways through a crisis? Have fact-checking or solutions journalism a chance to help people during the ongoing crisis?
Well, thank you. Such an important question. And thank you for inviting me. It's really a privilege to be here. I think the relationship between truth and change-making it gets back to our relationship to truth. Like if you think of like journalism as kind of like a doctor's appointment, if I can use an analogy, when you go to your doctor, you need to know three things. So you need to know what's the diagnosis. Do you have an illness? You need to know what the causes are. And you need to know what your treatment options are, what you can do about it, right? If the doctor only tells you how sick you are and doesn't leave any time for the treatment options, which is what journalism does. Journalism tells you how sick you are, but it doesn't tell you what you can do about it. People then have trouble receiving that information. So it doesn't matter how true it is. People can absorb information that is only telling them something that overwhelms them. And that's one of the reasons why we see so much misinformation, because so many people today feel so out of control with the world and sometimes in their personal lives that the receptivity for truth is become a very difficult emotional situation, which is why it is so easy to exploit people with misinformation. Now, facts, of course, matter, but as we all know, that's not enough. You have to have a relationship with people in a way that, one, they trust you through the quality of the relationship, and two, that the information is information they can receive as a human being, not as a robot. And I think if we do that, we would see that misinformation would be less effective on many people.
Yeah, the point of being kind of robot is very important, and I will come back to that point. But I want to continue with information overload point. When I read the Factfulness of Hans Rosling, I was shocked because as a book and a project, Factfulness shows that how people are over-informed about the world's problems by outdated data. Our views on existing problems are mostly distorted, and I believe it is a huge trap for changemakers and activists. In a world, we are surrounded by misinformation, outdated data, exaggeration, and information overload. How can changemakers find a way to define real social problems to solve?
To define them?
Yeah. How we can find the problems are real. How we can see them as they are, and how we can separate the real problems from the problems have been already solved.
Yeah. I mean, I think, what we have found in the Solutions Journalism Network, we have worked with 500 news organizations and 20,000 journalists to create a belief that reporting on solutions is part of the core function of news. So for us, the solution to this problem is, and we actually, we use factfulness and we use Hans Rosling's quiz on journalists, and they always get it wrong. Journalists don't know the same as the public. They don't realize how much progress has been made, especially around health and well-being in the world in the last 50 years or so. But our brains have a tendency to focus more on negative information than positive information, or information that is helpful. That's probably from evolution. It's probably a survival mechanism that has adapted over time. So it's very important whenever you are describing a problem to also look at how that problem has changed over time. The problem may still continue, but it may be diminished considerably compared to what that problem was 20 years ago. That's a really important fact for people to understand the trend line associated with a problem. People can understand change over time very easily, and that's the way that they understand the nature of the problem. The second thing is, whenever you are describing a problem, if you have the opportunity to help people understand what the credible options are that are emerging in their field. So if you are describing, for example, mental health problems, which we have, I think, probably a crisis in the United States, but in many countries, looking at what are the most effective emerging models that are actually helping people, and pairing the information as you deliver it. It's like, it just makes it, people will receive it and they'll actually remember it. They'll remember the problem, and the problem will create anxiety and fear, which is what threats do to us. And a sense of options and efficacy will create a sense of possibility, an awareness, even perhaps a sense of hope. It's by putting those emotions together that a human being can actually absorb that information and make it useful. They'll remember it better. They'll share it with more people. They're likely to go back to the news. I mean, one of the biggest problems with journalism in the world today is news avoidance, which is very high in Turkey, very high in the United States as well. Most people now in some countries are actively avoiding journalism because they can't, even in the United States, the Department of Health, the CDC, told people to limit their news consumption for their health. So when the government is telling you that, so we really have to understand that, and Hans Rosling has been a genius at this. So has Max Roser at Oxford, who graphs trend lines over time. It's very important to understand that as serious as the problems are in the world, there are some very hopeful trend lines if you look at history over generations.
Yeah, very important notice. Problem-based reporting causes a sense of powerlessness and mistrust towards institutions also. People begin to see each other as enemies. When trust is absent, uncertainty becomes a proper place for conspiracy theories to spread. In the countries like Turkey, in polarized environments, we see people feel powerless day by day. And civil society and social entrepreneurship also are being damaged by authoritarianism. And I think it creates a dilemma. The solutions are not coming from the hands of people. They have not enough the power to do that. Every time a journalist highlights a solution, it takes a risk of shining policies of governance. What do you see in other countries? How could solutions journalism or fact-checking stay away from being seen as the government's tool? Could you give us a global perspective about that?
Yeah, of course. I think just generally speaking, powerlessness is a really bad thing. When people feel powerless, they either ignore problems or they deny them, like we see with climate change, or they want to have people who become authoritarians to take care of them. They actually give their power away in very dangerous ways. People who are powerless, it's not a very adaptive place for human beings to feel powerless. We actually crave a sense of control. It's really important for mental health, but it's important for making good decisions too. So that's just a core thing. I think journalism should feed a sense of power, should give people a sense of efficacy and control over their lives, over their society. Otherwise, it will feed authoritarianism and it will feed polarization, for sure. It will create more conflict. We see this in the world, in every society. In terms of the role of the government, I mean, one of the basic problems that journalism has with governments is that journalism is always adversarial to governments. It thinks it's always supposed to be telling people how terrible the government is 100% of the time. Now, in some cases, the government is terrible 100% of the time. Generally speaking, there are shades of gray with almost everything. Even terrible governments sometimes do good things, and even authoritarians sometimes make sensible policies. Now, that's not to say we should pander ever. The way that solutions journalism handles a situation is we try to move people from thinking like lawyers to thinking like engineers, right? A lawyer is always looking at for and against, us and them. Is it good or is it bad? What's the verdict? Do you agree with it or do you disagree with it? An engineer is looking at how could we make the school system run better? How could we help elderly people in our society? How could we better protect poor people who are unable to work because of COVID? When you ask how-to questions, you end up thinking more creatively about possible solutions. It's actually a way of thinking that is less divisive. It's less polarizing. It's also less likely to attract, immediate condemnation from authoritarians. It's not pandering to them, but you're asking questions that are more subversive. They get underneath the radar and you can sometimes open the conversation up in a way that even people who oppose your thinking, who are against you, will listen. And, once again, this is not reducing investigative journalism in any ways, but we can ask additional questions. We don't always have to ask, do you agree with this policy? We can ask, how could this policy have been improved? How could this institution have been improved? Even people of good faith will lean into that question in a more creative way, and it will actually produce more creativity. And it can be added to the mix. And sometimes you get surprising responses. You discover that people you think are your enemies are not 100% your enemies. They may only be 70% your enemies, but there may be an opportunity there for some alliances that previously you didn't see.
Yeah, definitely. Keeping away from the thinking and understanding the world with binaries may help us to be together, maybe in the same table to keep in dialogue or feed each other. So from this perspective, I want to come to the relationship between the journalism and social entrepreneurship. Most of the journalists I have met do their jobs because they would like to help people to get the uncovered information. On the other hand, social entrepreneurs want to improve the world, find innovative ways to solve social and environmental problems. My experience showed that those two are the perfect match. What could social entrepreneurship and journalism learn from each other? How they can empower one another?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the simplest answer is that journalists should redefine their roles, in my view. You know, I think currently most journalists think my role is to inform the public about threats and problems, right? Sunlight is the best disinfectant. And many journalists believe that our primary job is to tell people what's going wrong and then let someone figure out how it will be fixed without being specific. What we find is that when journalists actively investigate efforts to solve problems and bring that information into the conversation, the social entrepreneurs become people who are the experts in it. They're the people who have been working on problem solving for a long time. They have a lot to say. They end up having a more prominent role in the conversation, often than government officials or researchers, because they're actually in the trenches trying to solve problems. So, and one of the things that we have found with journalists, which I think may be the most important thing for solutions journalism, is that when you report on efforts to solve social problems and you're able to show what's possible or new potential ideas that are showing progress, it makes the previous policy or the previous activity illegitimate. It actually creates more pressure for change when you show what's possible. So if journalists regularly work with, use solutions journalism as sources, or perhaps regular coverage about problem solving, they will end up putting more pressure on governments and more pressure on other actors to improve their performance. It's like if you're playing a game of football and you see the father says or the mother says, you see the kid across the street, he's getting more goals than you, and it's because he's kicking it this way. He's getting his back into it or something. You're able to create positive pressure for improvement through comparisons. And ultimately, this is one of the ways that solutions journalism has the best effect. It creates more pressure to show people that their performance is not good enough, because look at what's happening in this city, or look at what's happening in this other country, or look at what's happening in this other department. We can improve. But it creates that message in a way that doesn't create a sense of fatalism or apathy, or even, it doesn't humiliate people. We don't have to humiliate people to cause change. We can inspire people, or we can challenge them to do better as well. And I think sometimes journalists rely too much on shame and humiliation. Those are very toxic emotions. They lead to a lot of violence. They lead to people wanting to just shut you down. It ends conversations. And we have to remember that if we're using those tools in a society where people have guns and power, we make the world more dangerous. Yeah. Not to say we shouldn't shame people. None of this is all or nothing, but we have to there's a skillfulness in the way we communicate that allows us perhaps to create more openings for change than we sometimes see.
Yeah, actually, I want to ask a very personal question. But while you were mentioning about the journalists' perspective and their approach to their work, I remember our experiences at Teyit with journalists. Mostly, we have experienced when we talk about the perspective of journalists to their stories. They don't check the news. They don't check the sources. They most of the time they agree with us. Don't agree with us actually, and they are trying to accuse us with for example, don't teach our work to us. Have you ever experienced this kind of situations, and how do you solve this problem about journalists' perspective on their jobs? How do you communicate with them? How do you work with them actually?
Well, so this is a very hard problem. If you can't hold people accountable for doing trustworthy work, if they still have a following and they still have a good career. I mean, we have, Fox News in the United States as one example where people are not trustworthy on many issues, but they have a massive following. Many of the journalists there, or many of the talking heads, it doesn't harm them at all that they are not tethered to facts. So it's a very, very difficult problem. My sense is that, if you show the positive deviance, who are the people in your community who are actually doing, people that you might look up to, people that you might actually be friends with, who are actually doing a better job than you, who are telling the truth more often, even if they're not always telling the truth all the time. They're telling it 50% of the time, you're telling it 20% of the time. You can create pressure for people to improve by comparing them with people that they want to be like. So, one of the things that works, for example, in improving surgeons' behavior in the United States, surgeons are people who do not like to be told they're making mistakes. But hospitals sometimes have lists in the operating room of the number of the surgeons who have the greatest number of infections in their patients, and nobody likes to be the top of that list. So we can use some of those things to show how we're ranking, but the rankings have to be people who care about each other. They're not going to care about a ranking with somebody who they consider a completely different, having a different function. That's one way to do it. The other is sometimes there's a process problem. When people don't have the facts and information in journalism, often they just don't have enough time. They haven't been given enough time in their daily jobs to dig up the facts. They might have to produce 3 stories a day or whatever. So when you get into those process problems, you can actually work with journalists and create certain kinds of tools, data tools. We do that help journalists have an easier time quickly getting to a fact rather than just Googling something on the internet and using the first citation that comes up. So most journalists don't have enough support from resources like that, and that would be an important factor. I know that that's something that your work focuses on, so I think it's very important.
Yeah. Thank you very much. This was a really great point for me. We are approaching the end of the time, but I want to ask one more question. In your book, you quoted Gandhi. He says, we shouldn't confuse what is habitual with what is normal. What do you see in the world nowadays, which is habitual but doesn't seem normal? What does disturb you in these days?
I mean, if you think about, since we're talking about journalism, how crazy it has become. I mean, just consider, we live in a world of 8 billion people where, pretty soon almost every family in the world will have this thing in their hand where they can hear 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, anything that happens in the world almost immediately. And what we tell them is the worst thing that happened every 20 minutes. A bomb went off somewhere in Mongolia. A shooting happened somewhere in the United States. This politician, Modi, did this. Putin did this. We have a 24/7 continual information system that captures information from 8 billion people. And we continually put really scary, threatening, problem-focused news into people's hearts and heads on a regular basis. And we don't think that that is going to be a problem for the human being to digest and to manage that information. It's like feeding people the worst sugar food all the time, nonstop, and not thinking that they're going to become unhealthy. And yet this is normal. And because this system has changed so quickly, the media has emerged to be global and immediate just in the past 20 years, 25 years. But the kind of information, the way we use information to activate people, to draw out people's imagination, to draw out people's love and their caring is not thought through. We're doing it mindlessly. So I think there's an enormous habituality to that doesn't make sense for human beings anymore. And I think if we look at it, frankly, it's crazy.
David, thank you very much. I appreciate your vision and your job in Solutions Journalism Network. I am very happy to be here with you today. In the world of crisis, getting accurate information for change making is crucial. We may start our paths without proper information ecosystem and solutions-based reporting. The change is only possible when it's theory based on the reality. We should keep the support organizations which are building the rules and common principles for information ecosystem. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you again, David. Istam, microphone is yours.